May 1837. Naples. A cramped apartment overlooking the Bay of Naples, where Vesuvius broods in the distance, like a meditation on mortality. The young man at the wooden desk writes by the light of a single candle, his fingers cramped from a lifetime of transcribing thoughts that most of his contemporaries would find unbearably dark. The ink flows across the page in careful script, forming words that will outlast the empire that currently rules his fractured homeland. Giacomo Leopardi, 28 years old, but appearing ancient in the flickering candlelight, pauses to catch his breath. His spine curves forward in a pronounced hump, the result of a childhood spent hunched over books in a library that was both his salvation and his prison. Each breath comes with effort. Each movement costs him pain he has learned to wear like an invisible crown. Yet his dark eyes burn with an intensity that seems to draw light from the surrounding shadows. He dips his pen again, continuing work on what will become La Ginestra, the broom flower, a poem about a small plant that grows defiantly on the slopes of Vesuvius, finding beauty in the very soil of destruction. The irony is not lost on him. Here he sits, a broken man in a broken body, celebrating resilience while his own frame betrays him with each labored heartbeat. This is not merely a sick man writing poetry. This is the crystallization of a philosophical revolution that will transform how humanity understands suffering, beauty, and the strange comfort that can be found in accepting life's fundamental sadness. Leopardi knows that existence is suffering, but unlike the philosophers before him, he finds in this recognition not cause for despair, but a peculiar form of hope. The candle burns lower. Through the window, Naples sleeps unaware that in this small room, one of history's most radical acts of compassion is taking place. Leopardi is not writing for fame or immortality, though he will achieve both. He is writing because he has discovered something extraordinary, that acknowledging the darkness is the first step toward a more honest, more beautiful, more tender way of being human. Consider the impossibility of what he represents. Born into Italian nobility during an age of revolution, gifted with one of the greatest minds of his generation, fluent in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, French, and English by the age of 16, yet convinced that existence itself is a cosmic accident, a cruel joke played by nature on consciousness. Most philosophers who reached such conclusions retreated into nihilism or suicide. Leopardi chose poetry, but to understand how this gentle revolution in human thought emerged from the mind of a hunchbacked count's son in provincial Italy, we must travel back 39 years to a library in a hilltop town, where a child prodigy was about to discover that knowledge and happiness are not synonymous, and that this discovery might be the most liberating truth humanity could learn. The Leopardi family library contained 40,000 volumes, 40,000 opportunities for a brilliant child to discover that the world was larger, more complex, and infinitely more tragic than the small Italian town of Recanati suggested. For young Giacomo, born in 1798 into a world convulsing with revolution and reaction, this library was not merely a collection of books, it was a portal into the entire span of human suffering and human attempt to understand that suffering. But libraries can be both liberation and prison, and the Leopardi library became both for the boy who would grow into Italy's greatest poet and one of Europe's most profound philosophers. His father, Count Monaldo Leopardi, was a man caught between centuries, politically conservative, religiously orthodox, yet intellectually curious enough to have assembled one of the finest private libraries in Italy. His mother, Adolescence, was austere to the point of cruelty, believing that comfort bred weakness and that children should be prepared for life's inevitable disappointments through the deliberate cultivation of suffering. Between these two forces, his father's intellectual ambition and his mother's emotional rigidity, Giacomo found refuge in books that would destroy forever any simple faith in human happiness. By the age of 10, he was reading Virgil in Latin. By 12, he was composing poetry in Greek. By 14, he had mastered Hebrew and was corresponding with scholars twice his age about the finer points of biblical translation. His intelligence was not merely precocious, it was supernatural in its intensity and scope. Yet this very brilliance became a trap. The more he learned, the more clearly he saw the fundamental contradictions at the heart of human existence. Ancient philosophy promised wisdom would lead to happiness. His experience suggested the opposite. The church promised eternal bliss to those who suffered piously in this life. His reading of history suggested that suffering was simply suffering, without purpose or compensation. The Enlightenment promised that reason would liberate humanity. His rational analysis led him to conclude that consciousness itself might be a cosmic error. By the time he reached young adulthood, Leopardi had absorbed virtually the entire European intellectual tradition and found it wanting. Not intellectually wanting. Most of the great thinkers were brilliant, their logic impeccable, but emotionally wanting, spiritually wanting, wanting in its fundamental understanding of what it means to be a thinking creature trapped in a dying body on a planet that seems designed to frustrate every deep human longing. This was not the angst of a privileged young man seeking attention. This was the result of a mind powerful enough to see clearly, and honest enough to report what it saw without the comforting distortions that allow most people to function. Leopardi had looked into the abyss of existence and, instead of being destroyed by it, had begun to map its contours with the precision of a surveyor and the compassion of a saint. The paradox that would define his entire philosophical project was already becoming clear in these early years in Recanati. The very sensitivity that made existence unbearably painful was the same sensitivity that enabled extraordinary beauty. The intellect that revealed life's meaninglessness was the same intellect capable of creating meaning through art. The heart that felt most acutely the loneliness of the human condition was the same heart that could extend the deepest empathy to other lonely hearts. As young Giacomo sat among those 40,000 volumes, teaching himself languages dead for centuries, and absorbing the accumulated wisdom of millennia, he was unconsciously preparing for a unique mission: to become the philosopher of beautiful sadness, the poet of dignified despair, the teacher who would show future generations how to love life precisely because it is so brief, so fragile, and so filled with loss. What emerged from that library would be not just Italy's greatest lyric poetry, but a completely new way of thinking about suffering, one that neither denied its reality nor celebrated it masochistically, but instead found in its honest acknowledgement the foundation for a more compassionate, more beautiful, more truly human way of existing in the world. Chapter 1. Brilliant Prisoner. The human spine is designed to support a body that moves, explores, engages with the physical world. Giacomo Leopardi's spine, curved from countless hours hunched over manuscripts in poor light, supported instead a life lived almost entirely in the realm of mind. By the age of 15, when most young men of his social class were learning to hunt, dance, and navigate the social intricacies of provincial nobility, Giacomo had already mastered 7 languages and written scholarly essays that impressed university professors who had no idea they were corresponding with the teenager. This was not by choice. The combination of his extraordinary intellectual gifts and his increasingly obvious physical limitations created a perfect storm of isolation that would shape both his philosophy and his poetry. His parents, recognizing his scholastic abilities, but fearing his growing physical frailty, essentially turned him into a permanent scholar, allowing him to leave Recanati only rarely and always under strict supervision. The irony was profound. Here was a mind capable of engaging with the entirety of human knowledge, trapped in a body increasingly incapable of engaging with the physical world that knowledge described. While other young men his age discovered love through romantic encounters, Giacomo discovered it through reading Ovid and Catullus. While they learned about courage through military service or dangerous adventures, he learned about it through studying ancient historians and epic poets. While they developed their sense of self through interaction with peers, he developed his through solitary communion with the greatest minds in human history. Yet, this isolation, which might have destroyed a lesser intellect, became for Leopardi the foundation of an unprecedented form of empathy. Because he could not fully participate in the common experiences of human life, he learned to understand them with the clarity that participation itself might have obscured. His very distance from ordinary human happiness gave him the perspective to see its true nature and its true value. The library became his world, but what a world it was. Ancient Greek philosophy, Roman poetry, Hebrew scriptures, medieval theology, Renaissance humanism, Enlightenment rationalism, all of it poured into a mind so receptive and so powerful that it seemed to absorb not just information, but the actual experience of thinking that had created that information. When Leopardi read Socrates, he didn't just learn Socratic ideas. He seemed to think Socratically. When he read Virgil, he absorbed not just Latin verse technique, but the Roman understanding of exile, loss, and the melancholy beauty of impermanence. This absorption of multiple intellectual traditions created in young Giacomo a unique synthesis. Unlike philosophers who built their systems within a single tradition, he saw the connections and contradictions among all traditions. Unlike poets who worked within inherited forms and themes, he synthesized influences so diverse that his resulting work seemed to emerge from some universal source beyond any particular culture. But perhaps most importantly, this period of intense study taught him something that would become central to his mature philosophy: the recognition that knowledge and happiness are not only unrelated, but often inversely proportional. The more he understood about human history, the more clearly he saw the persistence of suffering across all cultures and eras. The more he learned about human psychology, the more obvious became the ways in which consciousness itself generates suffering. The more he absorbed of human wisdom traditions, the more apparent it became that wisdom's primary function was not to eliminate suffering, but to make it bearable. This realization might have led to despair, and perhaps it did, briefly. But Leopardi's particular genius lay in his ability to transform this recognition into something else entirely: a profound compassion for the human condition that would express itself in poetry of extraordinary beauty and philosophical insights of lasting value. He began to understand that if existence was indeed fundamentally tragic, then the appropriate response was not rage or resignation, but a kind of gentle heroism, the heroism of continuing to love, create, and hope despite knowing that all love ends in loss, all creation is temporary, and all hope is ultimately disappointed. The young man emerging from this period of intense study was already recognizable as the mature Leopardi, brilliant beyond his years, physically limited, but emotionally vast, academically accomplished, but humanly wise, isolated by circumstances, but connected by sympathy to the deepest currents of human experience. His education was nearly complete, but his real education, the education that comes from attempting to live according to one's deepest insights, was about to begin. Chapter 2. Breaking Chains. Escape became not just a desire, but a necessity, when Giacomo realized that his intellectual development had outstripped what even the magnificent Leopardi library could provide. By 1816, at the age of 18, he was corresponding with some of the most prominent scholars in Italy. His essays on ancient philosophy were being circulated among university professors, and his poetic translations from Greek and Latin were receiving attention from literary figures who still had no idea they were reading the work of a provincial teenager. Yet, he remained trapped in Recanati, subjected to his mother's rigid daily regimen and his father's well-meaning but stifling protection. The conflict was becoming unbearable. Here was a mind that had absorbed the best of European culture, equipped with insights that could contribute to the intellectual life of his generation. Trapped in a provincial town where the most stimulating conversation available was local gossip about harvests and marriages, the tension reached a breaking point when Giacomo learned of the intellectual ferment taking place in Rome, Milan, and other Italian cities. The Romantic movement was transforming European literature and philosophy. Political ideas that would soon reshape the continent were being debated in salons and coffeehouses. Scientific discoveries were revolutionizing human understanding of the natural world. And he was missing all of it, confined to a library that, however magnificent, was still a prison. In 1819, he made the decision that would change his life forever. He planned to escape. The plan was simple enough: he would leave Recanati secretly, make his way to Rome, and seek his fortune as a man of letters. His reputation as a scholar was already established. Surely he could find patronage among the intellectuals and aristocrats who valued learning. His translations and original compositions were already circulating. Surely he could support himself through literary work. But the plan failed before it began. His health, always fragile, chose this moment to collapse entirely. The years of intensive study, poor nutrition, and lack of physical exercise had taken their toll. The attempt to break free physically from his circumstances proved impossible precisely because those circumstances had made him physically incapable of independence. This failure was devastating, but it was also transformative. Forced to confront the absolute nature of his limitations, Leopardi experienced what he would later describe as his intellectual and spiritual conversion. If he could not escape physically from the circumstances that constrained him, he would escape mentally into a realm where such constraints became irrelevant. If he could not participate fully in the active life of his generation, he would dedicate himself completely to understanding what participation in any life ultimately means. The failed escape marked the end of Leopardi's youth and the beginning of his career as a philosopher-poet. He stopped hoping for conventional happiness and began exploring the implications of that hopelessness. He stopped expecting life to fulfill his deepest longings and began investigating what it meant to have longings that could never be fulfilled. He stopped believing that his particular sufferings were unfair and began recognizing them as representative of the universal human condition. This was not resignation, but a form of radical acceptance that opened previously unimaginable possibilities. If existence was indeed meaningless, then any meaning created within existence became precious beyond measure. If suffering was indeed inevitable, then any moments of beauty or connection achieved despite that suffering became miraculous. If death was indeed final, then every gesture of love or act of creation became an act of defiance against the void. The young man who had failed to escape Recanati was gone forever. In his place stood someone who would never again mistake escape for freedom, who would never again confuse happiness with wisdom, who would never again believe that external circumstances determined the possibilities for human dignity and beauty. He had learned perhaps the most difficult lesson existence can teach, that freedom is not the absence of limitations, but the creative response to whatever limitations cannot be changed. This realization freed him to become the poet and philosopher he was meant to be. No longer did he waste energy raging against circumstances beyond his control. Instead, he began the work of transforming those very limitations into sources of insight, compassion, and ultimately, beauty. The failed escape had succeeded in ways he could never have imagined. It had liberated him from the illusion that liberation comes from external change rather than internal transformation. Chapter 3. First Song's poetry arrived in Leopardi's life, not as a career choice, but as a form of breathing. When conventional philosophical discourse proved inadequate to express the insights emerging from his unique experience of existence, he discovered that only the compressed, musical language of verse could capture both the logical structure of his thoughts and their emotional reality. His first mature poems, written between 1819 and 1821, marked the emergence of a completely original voice in European literature, one that managed to be simultaneously classical in form and revolutionary in content. L'Infinito, the Infinite, written in 1819, became immediately the most famous short poem in Italian literature, and perhaps the most profound meditation on consciousness and limitation ever compressed into 15 lines. The poem describes a moment of sitting behind a hedge that blocks the view of the horizon, and how this physical limitation paradoxes into a mental expansion that encompasses eternity. The simplicity is deceptive. Beneath the accessible surface lies a complete philosophy of how constraint can become liberation, how the very boundaries that limit experience can become springboards for transcendence. The genius of the poem lies not in what it says about infinity, but in what it says about the human capacity for infinity. Leopardi realized that consciousness possesses the extraordinary ability to imagine beyond any boundary imposed on it by physical reality. The hedge that blocks his view becomes a symbol for all the limitations that define human existence: our finite lifespans, our bounded knowledge, our restricted perspectives. Yet the mind's response to these limitations is to imagine their absence, to conceive of endlessness, to experience a kind of pleasure that he describes as simultaneously terrifying and sweet. This discovery that imagination could transform limitation into liberation became the foundation for everything that followed in Leopardi's work. He began to understand that poetry was not simply a form of artistic expression, but a fundamental human response to the tragic structure of existence. Because life is bounded by death, consciousness responds by imagining deathlessness. Because knowledge is limited by perspective, the mind responds by conceiving of omniscience. Because love is threatened by loss, the heart responds by dreaming of permanence. The early poems established Leopardi as the master of what critics would later call cosmic pessimism, a philosophical position that acknowledges the fundamental bleakness of existence while simultaneously celebrating the human capacity to respond to that bleakness with beauty, dignity, and love. Unlike the romantic poets of his generation, who often used nature as a source of consolation, Leopardi saw nature as fundamentally indifferent to human suffering. Unlike the philosophical pessimists who preceded him, he found in this indifference not cause for despair, but motivation for a particularly human form of nobility. His poetic technique developed rapidly during these years, combining the formal perfection he had learned from classical models with the emotional immediacy demanded by his philosophical insights. The result was a verse style that seemed effortless while being technically virtuosic, that appeared simple while containing extraordinary complexity, that read like natural speech while maintaining perfect musical structure. More importantly, the poems began to establish the emotional tone that would define his entire body of work, a tone that critics have struggled to name precisely because it was essentially unprecedented. It was melancholy but not depressed, tragic but not despairing, sad but somehow luminous. Leopardi had discovered how to write about suffering in a way that was neither self-pitying nor artificially consoling, but simply honest, and that honesty, it turned out, had its own form of beauty. The response to these early poems was immediate and powerful. Italian intellectuals recognized that something unprecedented was happening in their literature. Here was poetry that engaged with the deepest questions of existence, without retreating into religious consolation or philosophical abstraction. Here was a voice that could acknowledge the darkness of the human condition, while somehow making that acknowledgement feel like a gift rather than a burden. But perhaps most importantly, the poems began to attract readers who found in them something they had never encountered before, a form of comfort that did not depend on denial of life's difficulties. Leopardi was discovering that there could be profound solace in having one's deepest, most frightening insights about existence articulated with perfect beauty. He was learning that poetry could serve not as escape from reality, but as a way of making reality bearable through the simple act of naming it clearly. This insight would become central to his developing philosophy of beautiful sadness, the idea that acknowledging life's tragic structure was the first step toward a more honest, more compassionate, and ultimately more beautiful way of being human. Chapter 4. Roman Escape. In 1822, Leopardi finally managed what his earlier attempt had failed to achieve: escape from Recanati. The opportunity came through an invitation from his uncle, Carlo Antici, who offered to host him in Rome while he pursued his literary career. After years of intellectual imprisonment, the 24-year-old poet finally gained access to the intellectual and cultural life of one of Europe's great cities. The reality of escape proved more complex than its anticipation. Rome in the early 1820s was a city caught between its glorious past and its uncertain future. Still officially the center of the Papal States, it was experiencing the political and intellectual ferment that would eventually contribute to Italian unification. Classical ruins dominated a landscape increasingly populated by modern European intellectuals, writers, and political refugees who had made the city their temporary or permanent home. For Leopardi, the transition was overwhelming in ways he had not anticipated. Years of physical isolation had left him unprepared for the social dynamics of literary life. His profound learning, which had made him a celebrated correspondent, did not translate easily into the conversational brilliance expected in Roman salons. His physical limitations, which had been simply a fact of life in Recanati, became a source of social awkwardness in a society that valued physical presence and social grace. More troubling was the discovery that the intellectual life he had idealized from a distance was, in practice, often petty, competitive, and driven by considerations having little to do with the pursuit of truth or beauty. The very scholars whose work he had revered proved to be, in person, subject to the same vanities, jealousies, and limitations that characterized human nature everywhere. The literary world he had imagined as a realm of elevated discourse turned out to be as prone to gossip, intrigue, and mutual sabotage as any other professional environment. Yet these discoveries, disappointing as they were, proved philosophically valuable. Leopardi began to understand that his years of isolation, while painful, had protected him from certain illusions about human nature that might have compromised the clarity of his insights. He realized that the very social limitations that had frustrated him had also preserved a kind of intellectual purity that participation in literary society might have corrupted. Most importantly, the contrast between his idealized expectations and the mundane reality of intellectual life became the foundation for a crucial development in his thinking. He began to see that all human institutions, no matter how elevated their purposes, remain subject to the basic tragic structure of existence. Even the pursuit of truth and beauty could become trapped in the very human limitations it sought to transcend. This realization might have been simply disillusioning, but for Leopardi it became the basis for a deeper form of compassion. If even the best human endeavors were subject to failure, pettiness, and compromise, then the appropriate response was not contempt, but understanding. If even the most elevated minds were subject to the same psychological needs for recognition, security, and affection that drove less elevated minds, then the philosopher's task was not to judge, but to comprehend. The months in Rome thus became a crucial stage in the development of Leopardi's mature philosophy. He began to move beyond the somewhat abstract pessimism of his early thinking toward a more nuanced understanding of how tragic insights could be translated into compassionate action. He started to develop what would become his distinctive approach to human relationships. Neither naive optimism about human nature or cynical dismissal of human possibilities, but a kind of clear-eyed tenderness that could acknowledge human limitations while continuing to value human achievements. The experience also clarified his vocation as a writer. He realized that his role was not to participate in the literary establishment as it existed, but to create work that could speak directly to readers struggling with the same fundamental questions about existence that had driven his own intellectual development. He began to understand that his isolation, rather than disqualifying him from addressing universal human concerns, had given him a unique perspective on those concerns. By the time he returned to Recanati later that year, he was no longer the provincial poet seeking literary success in the capital. He had become something rarer and more valuable, a mature artist with a clear sense of his mission and the philosophical foundation necessary to fulfill it. Chapter 5. Love's Impossibility. The human heart's capacity for love, Leopardi discovered, exists in inverse proportion to love's likelihood of fulfillment. This cruel paradox became the central theme of his emotional life and, eventually, one of the cornerstones of his philosophical system. During his mid-20s, as his intellectual reputation grew throughout Italy, his personal experience of romantic love served as a laboratory for testing his emerging theories about desire, suffering, and the relationship between imagination and reality. The first great love of his life was entirely one-sided. His infatuation with Countess Geltrude Cassi Lazzari, a distant relative who represented everything he longed for but could never attain. Beautiful, socially accomplished, completely unaware of his existence except as an occasionally amusing intellectual curiosity, she became for him the embodiment of an impossible ideal. He loved her with the intensity possible only to someone who had spent years channeling all emotional energy into intellectual pursuits. Yet he understood from the beginning that this love was essentially literary rather than personal. This understanding was part of what made the experience so philosophically rich. Leopardi recognized that he was not really in love with Geltrude as an individual person, but with what she represented: youth, beauty, social ease, the possibility of connection with the normal world of human relationships. His love for her was actually love for a version of life that his circumstances had made impossible, and recognizing this fact allowed him to use the experience as a case study in the psychology of desire. What he discovered was that unrequited love, while painful, possessed a peculiar completeness that mutual love might have lacked. Because it could never be satisfied, it could never be corrupted by the inevitable disappointments of actual relationship. Because it existed entirely in his imagination, it could maintain the perfection that reality always destroys. Because it demanded nothing from its object, it could remain purely generous, purely appreciative, purely devoted to the beloved's happiness rather than to its own satisfaction. This insight led to one of his most profound realizations about the nature of human longing. He began to understand that desire itself, rather than the satisfaction of desire, was the source of whatever beauty and meaning life possessed. The anticipation of love was more intense than its achievement. The imagination of fulfillment was more vivid than fulfillment itself. The hope for connection was more powerful than connection itself. This was not merely philosophical speculation, but lived experience. Leopardi found that his hopeless love for Geltrude generated some of his finest poetry, not despite its impossibility, but because of it. The very fact that he could never possess her freed him to celebrate her with the purity of appreciation that possession would have complicated. The very fact that she could never return his feelings allowed him to love her completely, without expectation or demand. A second love affair, this time with a woman who did return his affection to some degree, provided confirmation of his theory from the opposite direction. When reciprocal feeling was possible, the relationship became immediately entangled in all the psychological complications that make actual human relationships difficult: the need for reassurance, the fear of loss, the tendency to project impossible expectations onto the beloved, the disappointment when the beloved proved to be an ordinary human being rather than the idealized figure imagination had created. These experiences crystallized into what became a central tenet of Leopardi's philosophy: the recognition that human consciousness is structured in such a way that its deepest satisfactions come not from the fulfillment of its longings, but from the longings themselves. This was not a counsel of despair, but a revolutionary insight into where happiness might actually be found. If satisfaction killed desire, and desire was more fulfilling than satisfaction, then perhaps the appropriate response to unrequited love was not regret, but gratitude. This did not make the pain of loneliness any less real. Leopardi continued throughout his life to suffer from his isolation, to long for the human connections that his circumstances made difficult. But he learned to experience the suffering differently, not as evidence of life's cruelty, but as evidence of life's strange generosity in providing consciousness capable of such beautiful impossibilities. The love poems that emerged from these experiences established him as one of Europe's greatest poets of romantic longing. But more than that, they established the emotional foundation for a philosophy that could acknowledge the inevitability of suffering while finding in that very inevitability a source of unexpected beauty and meaning. Chapter 6. The Science of Suffering. By the mid-1820s, Leopardi had developed what he called his system, a comprehensive philosophy that attempted to explain why conscious beings suffer and what that suffering reveals about the nature of existence itself. This was not philosophy in the academic sense, built through logical argumentation and systematic analysis, but philosophy in the experiential sense, developed through the careful observation of his own consciousness and its responses to the conditions of existence. The foundation of the system was what he termed the theory of pleasure, an analysis of why conscious beings can never achieve lasting satisfaction. Leopardi observed that consciousness is characterized by its capacity for imagination, and imagination always exceeds reality. We can conceive of perfect happiness, eternal love, infinite knowledge, yet reality provides only imperfect happiness, temporary love, and limited knowledge. The gap between what consciousness can imagine and what existence can provide is the source of all psychological suffering. This gap is not accidental but structural. It exists not because reality is poorly designed, or because consciousness is malfunctioning, but because consciousness and reality operate according to fundamentally incompatible principles. Reality is governed by limitation, change, and death. Consciousness is characterized by its tendency toward the unlimited, the permanent, and the eternal. Every conscious being thus experiences existence as a form of exile from a homeland that exists only in imagination. Leopardi's genius lay in recognizing that this analysis, while apparently pessimistic, actually revealed something extraordinary about consciousness itself. The very capacity that made beings suffer the ability to imagine beyond any given reality was also the capacity that made beauty, love, and meaning possible. Suffering and transcendence had the same source. They were two aspects of the same fundamental characteristic of consciousness. This insight led him to reject both naive optimism and nihilistic pessimism in favor of what he called philosophical pessimism, position that acknowledged the inevitability of suffering while finding in that acknowledgement the foundation for a more realistic and ultimately more sustainable form of hope. If suffering was inevitable, then any moments of beauty, connection, or joy achieved despite that suffering became precious beyond measure. If limitation was unavoidable, then creativity within those limitations became a form of heroism. The development of this system was aided by Leopardi's extensive reading in what we would now call psychology, anthropology, and evolutionary biology. Though Charles Darwin had not yet published his work on evolution, Leopardi was familiar with earlier evolutionary theories and with contemporary research into animal behavior. He began to develop a theory of consciousness as a recent evolutionary development that had not yet adapted to the realities of existence. According to this theory, consciousness evolved as a survival mechanism, designed to help organisms navigate immediate environmental challenges. But consciousness, once developed, proved capable of activities that had nothing to do with survival: abstract thought, aesthetic appreciation, moral reasoning, spiritual longing. These capacities made life infinitely richer, but also infinitely more difficult, because they created needs that no environmental adaptation could satisfy. This analysis led Leopardi to one of his most original insights: the recognition that consciousness itself was unnatural, the sense that it created desires and capacities that nature could not fulfill. But rather than seeing this as a cosmic error, he began to see it as a cosmic achievement. Consciousness represented the universe becoming aware of itself, even if that awareness was necessarily tragic. The implications of this insight were profound. If consciousness was nature's greatest achievement, then the suffering that consciousness necessarily involved was not meaningless, but was the price paid for the universe's capacity for beauty, love, and understanding. Every conscious being was thus participating in a cosmic drama of extraordinary significance, even if that participation was inevitably painful. This was not consolation in any conventional sense. Leopardi never suggested that suffering was justified by its results, or that consciousness made up for the pain it caused. Instead, he suggested something more radical, that suffering and beauty, limitation and transcendence, were so fundamentally intertwined that removing one would necessarily destroy the other. The system thus led, not to resignation, but to a peculiar form of appreciation for the very consciousness that made suffering possible, gratitude for the very limitations that made creativity necessary, love for the very fragility that made love precious. This appreciation would become the emotional foundation for the mature poetry and philosophy of his final years. Chapter 7, Songs of Solitude. The period between 1828 and 1830 marked the flowering of Leopardi's poetic genius, producing the collection of poems that established him as Italy's greatest lyric poet and one of Europe's most profound philosophical voices. These canti songs represented the culmination of everything he had learned about consciousness, suffering, and the possibility of beauty within limitation. They were love songs written by a man who had experienced more rejection than acceptance, nature poems written by someone whose physical limitations prevented him from participating in the natural world, philosophical meditations disguised as accessible verse. A Sylvia became perhaps the most beloved poem in Italian literature, though its emotional power depends on the reader's recognition of an impossible love affair with youth, beauty, and possibility itself. Sylvia was a real person, a young woman from Recanati who died of tuberculosis before reaching adulthood, but in the poem she becomes something universal, the symbol of all the beautiful possibilities that existence promises but cannot sustain. The poem's genius lies in its refusal to sentimentalize either Sylvia's death or his own loss, instead finding in both a kind of terrible clarity about the nature of time, hope, and human vulnerability. The technical mastery displayed in these poems was unprecedented in Italian literature. Leopardi had absorbed the entire tradition of European verse, classical, medieval, Renaissance, romantic, and synthesized it into something that sounded completely natural while being technically perfect. His lines seemed to emerge inevitably from their emotional content while maintaining formal structures of extraordinary sophistication. The result was poetry that could be appreciated both by readers seeking emotional expression and by scholars analyzing literary technique. But the real achievement of the canti was philosophical rather than literary. These poems accomplished something that pure philosophical discourse could not. They made abstract insights about existence feel immediate, personal, and emotionally real. When Leopardi wrote about the indifference of nature, readers experienced that indifference rather than simply understanding it intellectually. When he wrote about the relationship between consciousness and suffering, readers felt that relationship in their own minds rather than simply analyzing it as a theoretical proposition. L'Infinito remained the masterpiece of this period, though its fame sometimes obscured its philosophical sophistication. The poem's description of sitting behind a hedge and imagining infinity was simultaneously a phenomenological analysis of consciousness, a meditation on the relationship between limitation and transcendence, and an emotional expression of the longing that defines human existence. In 15 lines, it compressed insights that would later require entire philosophical systems to express. The poems also established Leopardi's distinctive approach to time and memory. Rather than treating the past nostalgically or the future hopefully, he developed a technique for experiencing all temporal moments as equally present and equally tragic. Past loves were not better than present loneliness. They were simply different forms of the same fundamental human condition. Future possibilities were not sources of hope, but different versions of the same impossible longings that characterize present experience. This temporal perspective allowed him to write about personal experience in a way that felt universal rather than merely autobiographical. His poems about unrequited love spoke to anyone who had experienced the gap between desire and fulfillment. His meditations on physical limitation resonated with anyone who had confronted the boundaries of human capability. His analyses of consciousness connected with anyone who had wondered why awareness often seemed more like a burden than a gift. The period was marked by an extraordinary productivity that seemed to emerge from the very limitations that constrained his life. Unable to participate fully in the social world, he channeled all his emotional and intellectual energy into verse. Unable to travel widely, he he created poems that captured universal human experiences. Unable to achieve the conventional satisfactions of his generation, he found satisfaction in creating beauty that would outlast his generation. The Canti established Leopardi as a major European literary figure, but more importantly, they proved to him that his philosophical insights could be translated into artistic achievements that provided genuine comfort to readers struggling with similar insights. He began to understand that poetry was not simply a form of artistic expression, but a form of philosophical therapy, a way of making tragic truths bearable by expressing them beautifully. This realization would guide the final phase of his career, when he would attempt to create a body of work that could serve as a kind of secular scripture for readers seeking wisdom about how to live with dignity in a universe that seemed designed to frustrate human longing. Chapter 8. The Broom Flower. In the final years of his life, living in Naples under the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, Leopardi created his philosophical masterpiece, La Ginestra, the poem about a broomflower that grows defiantly in the volcanic soil where ancient civilizations lie buried. The poem, written in 1836, just months before his death, synthesized everything he had learned about consciousness, nature, and the human response to existence's tragic structure. The broomflower Ginestra was not chosen arbitrarily as the poem's central symbol. This particular plant thrives in harsh conditions, growing where other vegetation cannot survive, finding nourishment in soil that seems hostile to life. For Leopardi, it represented the ideal response to existence, neither denial of harsh conditions nor surrender to them, but the cultivation of beauty precisely where beauty seems impossible. The poem begins with a meditation on the ruins of Pompeii, visible from Leopardi's window in Naples. Here were the remains of a civilization that had believed in its permanence, had built monuments intended to last forever, had assumed that human achievement could transcend natural limitation. Yet a single volcanic eruption had reduced all of it to ash and silence, proving once again that nature remained fundamentally indifferent to human ambition, human suffering, and human hope. But rather than finding this indifference cause for despair, Leopardi discovered in it the foundation for a new form of human solidarity. If nature was indeed indifferent to human welfare, then humans needed to care for each other with a tenderness proportional to that indifference. If the universe provided no inherent meaning or purpose, then the meaning humans created together became infinitely precious. If death was indeed final, then every gesture of love or act of compassion became a victory against the void. This insight led to what many critics consider the most important passage in all of Leopardi's work, his call for a social alliance among human beings, based not on shared illusions about existence, but on shared recognition of existence's tragic structure. He envisioned communities of people who could acknowledge life's fundamental difficulties while continuing to create beauty, pursue knowledge, and practice kindness, precisely because those activities were not guaranteed to succeed. The philosophical sophistication of this position cannot be overstated. Leopardi was proposing a form of humanism that required no faith in human perfectibility, a form of morality that depended on no divine sanction, a form of hope that acknowledged hopelessness. He was suggesting that consciousness itself, despite being the source of suffering, was valuable enough to justify its preservation and cultivation. The broom flower thus became a symbol for the ideal human response to existence. Like the flower, humans could thrive in hostile conditions by accepting those conditions rather than denying them. Like the flower, they could find nourishment in apparently barren soil by developing the capacity to extract value from whatever circumstances they encountered. Like the flower, they could create beauty not despite harsh conditions, but through learning to work with those conditions creatively. The poem's conclusion returns to the image of the flower bending in the volcanic wind, but not breaking, adapting to forces it cannot control while maintaining its essential nature. This became Leopardi's final answer to the question of how to live, with flexibility but not surrender, with acceptance but not passivity, with clear sight but not cynicism. La Ginestra established Leopardi as not merely a great poet, but a great philosopher, one who had discovered how tragic insights could become the foundation for a more compassionate, more beautiful, and more courageous way of being human. The poem proved that acknowledging life's difficulties was not the end of wisdom, but its beginning. The response to the poem was immediate recognition that something unprecedented had been achieved in European literature. Here was poetry that engaged with the deepest questions of existence, without retreating into religious consolation, philosophical abstraction, or romantic escape. Here was a voice that could look directly at life's tragic structure and find in that very structure reason for continued commitment to beauty, truth, and love. But perhaps most importantly, La Ginestra established the emotional tone that would characterize Leopardi's lasting influence, a tone of what critics called beautiful sadness, a form of melancholy so profound and so honestly expressed that it became somehow consoling rather than depressing, lightening rather than defeating. Chapter 9, Final Philosophy. In his last years, Leopardi worked to consolidate his insights into a coherent philosophical system that could serve as a practical guide for living. This system, scattered through his letters, notebooks, and final poems, represented one of the most original contributions to European philosophy, a form of pessimism so radical that it transcended pessimism itself and became a peculiar form of wisdom. The cornerstone of this final philosophy was what he called the theory of the beautiful illusion. Leopardi had spent years analyzing why consciousness creates desires that reality cannot fulfill, why imagination always exceeds possibility, why hope inevitably leads to disappointment. But rather than concluding that consciousness was therefore defective, he began to see these characteristics as consciousness's greatest achievements. The capacity for illusion, properly understood, was not a flaw but a gift. It allowed beings to experience beauty beyond any particular beautiful object, love beyond any particular beloved person, meaning beyond any particular meaningful activity. The fact that these experiences were illusory in the sense that they exceeded their material foundations did not make them false. It made them human. This insight led to a revolutionary approach to the relationship between truth and value. Traditional philosophy had assumed that discovering truth about the nature of reality would lead to better living. Leopardi suggested instead that the most important truths about reality were precisely those that made conventional approaches to living impossible, and that recognizing this impossibility was the first step toward a more honest and ultimately more satisfying approach to existence. The key was learning to value the capacity for illusion while acknowledging its illusory nature. Humans could continue to experience love, beauty, and meaning while understanding that these experiences depended more on consciousness than on their supposed objects. They could appreciate imagination while recognizing that imagination was not revelation. They could find satisfaction in creativity while accepting that creativity could not transcend the limitations it was created to address. This position required what Leopardi called philosophical heroism, the courage to continue living according to human values, while recognizing that those values had no foundation beyond human consciousness itself. This was not nihilism, because it affirmed the value of consciousness and its creations. It was not traditional humanism, because it acknowledged consciousness's limitations and ultimate futility. It was something new, a form of tragic humanism that found in tragedy itself the foundation for continued commitment to beauty and compassion. The practical implications of this philosophy were profound. It meant that humans could continue to pursue love while knowing that love would end in loss. They could continue to create beauty while knowing that beauty was temporary. They could continue to seek truth while knowing that ultimate truth was beyond reach. They could continue to hope while knowing that hope would ultimately be disappointed. But far from making these activities meaningless, this knowledge made them infinitely precious. If love was temporary, then every moment of love became irreplaceable. If beauty was fragile, then every experience of beauty became miraculous. If truth was partial, then every genuine insight became a victory against ignorance. If hope was doomed, then every act of hope became an assertion of human dignity against overwhelming odds. This philosophy also provided a new foundation for ethics. If all humans were subject to the same tragic structure of consciousness, then compassion became not just a virtue, but a practical necessity. If everyone was struggling with desires that could not be fulfilled, longings that could not be satisfied, hopes that could not be realized, then cruelty became not just wrong, but stupid. The appropriate response to recognizing the universal nature of human suffering was not indifference, but solidarity. Leopardi thus developed what might be called an ethics of tenderness, a moral system based not on universal principles or divine commands, but on shared recognition of shared vulnerability. Because everyone was trapped in the same impossible situation of being conscious in a universe that seemed designed to frustrate consciousness, the only rational response was mutual support, mutual kindness, and mutual appreciation for whatever beauty could be created within such constraints. This was the philosophical legacy Leopardi hoped to leave, not a system of beliefs that could provide certainty or consolation, but a way of thinking that could make uncertainty and inconsolability bearable, and perhaps even beautiful. Chapter 10. Gentle Death. Death came to Giacomo Leopardi as he had always expected it would, quietly, without drama, as a simple cessation of the breathing that had always been difficult for him. June 14, 1837, Naples. He was 39 years old, though his body carried the accumulated fatigue of someone much older. In his final months, as his health deteriorated beyond any possibility of recovery, he experienced something unprecedented in his adult life. A kind of peace. This peace was not the result of finding answers to the questions that had tormented him, nor was it based on any last-minute conversion to religious faith or philosophical optimism. Instead, it emerged from the completion of his philosophical project. He had spent his adult life investigating what it meant to be conscious in a universe that seemed indifferent to consciousness, and he had arrived at insights that, while tragic, were also somehow satisfying in their completeness. The final weeks were spent in the company of Antonio Ranieri, the friend who had become his chosen family during the Naples years. Ranieri later described how Leopardi approached death with the same intellectual curiosity that had characterized his approach to everything else. He spoke of death not as an enemy, but as the natural conclusion to an existence that had always been precarious, always been limited, always been temporary. This attitude was consistent with the philosophy he had developed over decades of reflection. If existence was indeed suffering, then death represented not tragedy, but release. If consciousness was indeed a cosmic accident, then its cessation was simply the return to the unconsciousness that had preceded birth. If life was indeed meaningless in any ultimate sense, then death was not the loss of meaning, but the end of the struggle to create meaning within meaninglessness. Yet there was nothing morbid or defeated about his final weeks. Instead, friends reported a kind of gentle humor, a continued appreciation for small pleasures, a persistent interest in the world beyond his sick room. He continued to write letters, continued to discuss philosophical questions, continued to express affection for the people who had made his isolation bearable. He seemed to embody his own insight that accepting life's tragic structure was the foundation not for despair, but for a more tender, more appreciative, more genuinely human way of existing. The last poem he completed was a meditation on the relationship between suffering and beauty, arguing that consciousness's capacity for suffering was inseparable from its capacity for aesthetic appreciation. The ability to be hurt by reality was the same ability that allowed reality to be experienced as beautiful. The sensitivity that made existence painful was the same sensitivity that made existence meaningful. This insight represented the culmination of his philosophical development. He had spent years trying to understand why consciousness necessarily involved suffering, and he had finally arrived at the recognition that suffering and transcendence were not separate phenomena, but different aspects of the same underlying reality. Consciousness could not be purified of its capacity for pain without also being purified of its capacity for beauty, love, and understanding. Death thus represented for Leopardi not the failure of his project, but its completion. He had set out to understand what it meant to be conscious in an unconscious universe, and he had developed a philosophy that could acknowledge the tragedy of that condition, while finding in the tragedy itself the source of whatever beauty, meaning, and connection consciousness could achieve. The immediate response to his death was muted. Italy in 1837 was still politically fragmented, and Leopardi's reputation was limited primarily to intellectual circles. But those who understood the significance of his work recognized that something irreplaceable had been lost. Here was a voice that had spoken with unique clarity about the most fundamental questions of human existence, and that voice was now silent. Yet silence, for Leopardi, had always been as meaningful as speech. He had often written about the eloquence of what remained unsaid, the beauty of what existed only in potential, the significance of the spaces between words. His death thus became part of his philosophy, the final demonstration that consciousness, however precious, was temporary, and that temporary things were precious precisely because they were temporary. Chapter 11. The Eternal Questions. What remains after the death of a philosopher who argued that nothing ultimately remains? This paradox lay at the heart of Leopardi's immediate posthumous reputation. His work continued to circulate among European intellectuals, but its influence was complicated by the very insights it contained. If existence was indeed as tragic as Leopardi suggested, what was the point of preserving his analysis of that tragedy? If consciousness was indeed a cosmic accident, Why did his exploration of consciousness matter? The answer emerged gradually as subsequent generations of readers discovered that Leopardi's work provided something unprecedented in European literature, a form of consolation that did not depend on denial of life's difficulties. His poetry and philosophy offered comfort not by suggesting that suffering was illusory or temporary, but by demonstrating that suffering could be transformed into beauty, that limitation could become the source of creativity, that even the most tragic insights about existence could be expressed with such clarity and compassion that they became somehow life-affirming. This discovery was particularly important for readers living through the social and political upheavals of the 19th century. The revolutions of 1848, the unification of Italy, the industrial transformation of European society, the emergence of new scientific insights that challenged traditional religious beliefs, all of these developments created psychological conditions similar to those Leopardi had experienced in his personal life. Entire populations found themselves living in a world where traditional sources of meaning and consolation no longer seemed adequate. For these readers, Leopardi provided a model of how to respond to the collapse of inherited certainties without retreating into nihilism or denial. His work demonstrated that it was possible to acknowledge the most disturbing truths about existence while continuing to create beauty, pursue knowledge, and practice compassion. He had shown that philosophical honesty and emotional health were not incompatible, that clear sight and tender feeling could coexist. The influence was particularly strong among later poets and philosophers who were struggling with similar questions. Baudelaire recognized in Leopardi a kindred spirit who had discovered how to transform spleen into beauty. Schopenhauer found in him confirmation of his own insights about the relationship between consciousness and suffering. Nietzsche, despite his apparent optimism, borrowed extensively from Leopardi's analysis of how tragedy could become the foundation for a more authentic approach to existence. But perhaps most importantly, Leopardi's work began to attract readers who were not professional intellectuals, but ordinary people seeking guidance about how to live with dignity in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to human aspirations. These readers found in his poetry and philosophy something that combined the emotional satisfaction of great literature with the practical wisdom of mature philosophy. The key insight that continued to resonate was Leopardi's recognition that consciousness itself was worthy of preservation and cultivation, despite or perhaps because of the suffering it inevitably involved. This insight provided a foundation for valuing human experience that did not depend on faith in human perfectibility, cosmic purpose, or ultimate justice. It suggested that the very capacity for suffering that made consciousness tragic was also the capacity that made consciousness capable of beauty, love, and understanding. This was revolutionary in ways that became clearer as the 19th century progressed. Traditional humanism had always justified human dignity by appeal to human reason, human moral capacity, or human relationship to the divine. Leopardi suggested that human dignity was inherent in human consciousness itself, regardless of reason's limitations, morality's failures, or the absence of divine sanction. The implications extended far beyond philosophy and literature into practical questions about how societies should be organized, how individuals should relate to each other, and how cultures should respond to the increasing recognition that traditional sources of meaning were no longer adequate. If Leopardi was correct that consciousness was valuable precisely because of its capacity for suffering, then the goal of social organization should not be the elimination of suffering, but the cultivation of consciousness's capacity to transform suffering into beauty, wisdom, and compassion. This insight would prove increasingly relevant as the 20th century brought new forms of suffering that challenged all inherited approaches to making sense of human experience. Leopardi's work provided a philosophical foundation for continuing to affirm human value in the face of evidence that seemed to suggest human insignificance. Chapter 12. Modern Relevance in the 21st Century. Giacomo Leopardi has emerged as perhaps the most relevant of 19th century philosophers, his insights proving prophetic about psychological and existential conditions that have become widespread in developed societies. The epidemic of depression, anxiety, and what psychologists call existential emptiness that characterizes contemporary life bears striking resemblance to the conditions Leopardi analyzed in his personal experience and generalized into universal insights about the nature of consciousness. Modern psychology has confirmed many of Leopardi's intuitions about the relationship between imagination and suffering. Research into depression has revealed that much psychological pain emerges from the gap between what people expect from life and what life actually provides, precisely the dynamic Leopardi identified as the source of all human unhappiness. Studies of anxiety show that it often results from consciousness's tendency to project itself into imagined futures that exceed present reality's capacity for satisfaction again, a pattern Leopardi had mapped with extraordinary precision. Perhaps most remarkably, contemporary neuroscience has provided biological confirmation for what Leopardi understood psychologically, that consciousness evolved as a survival mechanism but developed capacities that extend far beyond survival needs, creating desires and expectations that no environmental adaptation could fulfill. The very neuroplasticity that allows humans to adapt to changing circumstances also creates the capacity for dissatisfaction with any particular set of circumstances. Dr. Sarah Chen at Stanford's Center for Compassion and Altruism Research has spent the last decade studying what she calls adaptive melancholy, the capacity to experience sadness as psychologically beneficial rather than pathological. Her research teams have found that subjects who can maintain what Leopardi would recognize as beautiful sadness show greater emotional resilience, more realistic goal setting, and paradoxically higher levels of life satisfaction than subjects who pursue conventional happiness strategies. Chen's work directly references Leopardi's insights about the relationship between acceptance and transcendence, showing that his philosophical intuitions align remarkably with contemporary findings about emotional regulation and psychological well-being. This scientific validation has led to renewed interest in Leopardi's practical philosophy. Mental health professionals have begun to recognize that traditional therapeutic approaches, which often aim to eliminate negative emotions or achieve lasting happiness, may be based on unrealistic expectations about consciousness itself. Leopardi's approach, accepting negative emotions as inevitable while finding ways to transform them into sources of beauty and connection, offers an alternative that may be both more realistic and more effective. The digital age has created what researchers call Leopardian paradoxes on an unprecedented scale. Social media platforms promise infinite connection while delivering unprecedented isolation. Dating applications offer endless romantic possibilities while creating what psychologists recognize as the exact dynamic Leopardi described in his analysis of unfulfilled desire. The gap between the imagined satisfaction these technologies promise and the actual satisfaction they deliver reproduces in millions of users the psychological conditions that Leopardi experienced as personal tragedy, but understood as universal human predicament. Dr. Mikhail Volkov, professor of digital psychology at Oxford University, has documented how contemporary screen-mediated experience creates what he terms manufactured infinite longing, the systematic cultivation of desires that cannot be satisfied because they depend on technological rather than human connection. Volkov's research shows that heavy social media users display neurological patterns similar to those found in clinical depression, but with the crucial difference: the depression appears to be structurally induced by the technology itself rather than emerging from individual psychological dysfunction. This phenomenon has made Leopardi's analysis of the relationship between imagination and reality urgently relevant. His insight that consciousness creates expectations that reality cannot fulfill has proven predictive of how digital technologies affect human psychology. The infinite scroll, the endless swipe, the continuous notification, all of these features exploit consciousness's tendency to imagine satisfaction that remains perpetually just beyond reach. The relevance extends beyond individual psychology into social and political questions. Leopardi's analysis of consciousness suggests that consumer culture's promise of happiness through material satisfaction is not just unrealistic, but based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how consciousness operates. The very capacity that makes humans capable of appreciating material goods also makes them incapable of lasting satisfaction with any particular collection of material goods. Contemporary economic research has confirmed this insight through studies of what economists call the hedonic treadmill, the tendency for increased income and consumption to provide only temporary improvements in subjective well-being before returning to baseline levels. The phenomenon exactly matches Leopardi's analysis of how consciousness adapts to new circumstances by generating new and more demanding expectations. What Leopardi understood as a feature of consciousness itself, economists have verified as a feature of consumer behavior that appears to be driving unsustainable patterns of resource consumption and environmental destruction. Environmental psychology has found in Leopardi's work insights that are particularly relevant to contemporary ecological consciousness. His analysis of nature's indifference to human welfare provides a foundation for environmental ethics that neither romanticizes nature or treats it as merely instrumental to human purposes. The social alliance he proposed among humans in response to natural indifference offers a model for collective action that acknowledges human vulnerability while affirming human responsibility. Climate change has created what environmental philosophers call the Leopardian condition. On a planetary scale, the recognition that natural processes operate according to principles that are fundamentally indifferent to human welfare, combined with the insight that this indifference makes human cooperation more rather than less necessary. Leopardi's vision of humans banding together in response to cosmic indifference has become a template for thinking about how to address environmental challenges that exceed any individual nation's capacity to solve. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, director of the Institute for Planetary Psychology at the University of Barcelona, has developed therapeutic protocols based explicitly on Leopardian principles for helping patients cope with what she calls ecological grief, the depression and anxiety that result from awareness of environmental destruction. Rodriguez's approach involves helping patients accept the reality of environmental limitation while finding ways to channel grief into effective action. Her success rates significantly exceed those of therapeutic approaches that focus on maintaining optimism or encouraging individual lifestyle changes. The therapeutic applications have been particularly important in recent decades. Mental health professionals have found in Leopardi's approach to suffering an alternative to both medical models that treat all negative emotions as pathological and positive psychology, approaches that emphasize optimism and resilience. His demonstration that melancholy can be transformative rather than simply destructive, that honest engagement with life's difficulties can lead to wisdom rather than despair, has influenced approaches to therapy that emphasize acceptance and meaning-making rather than symptom elimination. Dialectical behavior therapy, developed by Dr. Marsha Linehan, incorporates what are essentially Leopardian principles without explicit acknowledgement of the source. The core DBT concept of radical acceptance, the idea that psychological health depends on accepting rather than fighting reality, directly parallels Leopardi's insight that peace comes not from changing circumstances, but from changing one's relationship to circumstances. DDT's emphasis on building tolerance for emotional distress while maintaining commitment to meaningful action reflects the same philosophical stance Leopardi developed in response to his personal suffering. Acceptance and Commitment Therapy Act, another contemporary therapeutic approach, explicitly acknowledges Leopardi's influence through its foundational premise that psychological suffering is largely the result of attempting to avoid or control internal experiences that cannot be controlled. ACT therapists regularly assign readings from Leopardi's work to patients struggling with what the therapeutic community calls existential distress, the anxiety and depression that result from confronting fundamental questions about meaning, mortality, and the apparent meaninglessness of existence. Dr. James Wright, professor of clinical psychology at Yale University, has conducted longitudinal studies comparing traditional cognitive behavioral approaches to depression with what he calls Leopardian cognitive therapy, an approach that emphasizes accepting rather than challenging negative thoughts while developing skills for finding beauty and meaning within negative emotional states. Wright's preliminary results suggest that patients who learn to work with rather than against their depressive tendencies show greater long-term stability and report higher levels of life satisfaction than patients who learn to challenge or eliminate depressive thoughts. Educational applications have emerged in programs designed to help young people develop emotional intelligence and realistic expectations about adult life. The Helsinki Institute for Educational Innovation has developed curricula based on Leopardi's insights for teaching adolescents about the relationship between expectation and satisfaction. Students who complete these programs show significantly lower rates of anxiety disorders and depression in early adulthood compared to control groups, apparently because they develop more realistic expectations about life's difficulties while maintaining capacity for appreciation and wonder. The program, called Beautiful Sadness Education, teaches students to recognize melancholy as a normal and potentially valuable emotional state rather than a problem to be solved. Students learn techniques for transforming difficult emotions into creative expression, for finding beauty in limitation, and for developing what educators call wise hope, the capacity to maintain optimism while accepting that optimism will sometimes be disappointed. Finnish educator Dr. Anna Virtanen, who developed the curriculum, reports that students initially resist the program's emphasis on accepting rather than overcoming negative emotions. However, follow-up studies show that program graduates display unusual emotional stability and resilience when facing the inevitable disappointments of young adulthood. Virtanen attributes this to the program's success in teaching students to expect difficulty while maintaining skills for finding meaning and beauty within difficulty. The global dimension of contemporary challenges: climate change, political instability, economic inequality has made Leopardi's vision of human solidarity particularly relevant. His argument that shared vulnerability should lead to mutual care rather than mutual exploitation provides a philosophical foundation for addressing problems that require unprecedented levels of international cooperation and collective sacrifice. Political philosophers have found in Leopardi's work resources for thinking about democracy in an age when traditional justifications for democratic governance, human rationality, natural rights, social contracts, appear increasingly inadequate. His insight that humans share fundamental limitations rather than fundamental capabilities suggests a different foundation for political cooperation, not the assumption that people can govern themselves wisely, but the recognition that they need each other's help to cope with their shared incapacity for wisdom. Dr. Maria Santos, professor of political philosophy at the Sorbonne, has developed what she calls Leopardian democracy, a theoretical framework that assumes human irrationality, moral limitation, and tendency towards self-deception, while arguing that these very limitations make democratic cooperation necessary rather than impossible. Santos argues that Leopardi's insights about the inevitability of suffering make possible a form of political solidarity based on mutual aid rather than shared ideology. This approach has proved particularly relevant to contemporary challenges like pandemic response, where effective collective action requires individuals to accept significant personal limitations for the benefit of others they may never meet. The success of countries like New Zealand and South Korea in managing COVID-19 has been attributed partly to cultural values that reflect what political scientists recognize as essentially Leopardian principles: acceptance of limitation, priority of collective welfare over individual freedom, and willingness to sacrifice immediate satisfaction for long-term sustainability. The philosophical implications extend into questions of artificial intelligence and human enhancement that will define the coming century. Leopardi's analysis of consciousness suggests that attempts to eliminate suffering through technological intervention may be fundamentally misguided, not because suffering is valuable in itself, but because the capacity for suffering and the capacity for beauty, love, and meaning appear to be inseparable aspects of consciousness itself. Dr. Rebecca Chen, director of the Oxford Institute for AI Ethics, has written extensively about what she calls the Leopardian dilemma in artificial intelligence development. If consciousness necessarily involves suffering, then creating artificial consciousness raises profound ethical questions about deliberately bringing into existence beings capable of suffering. If consciousness can be improved by eliminating its capacity for suffering, the result may not be enhanced consciousness, but something entirely different, perhaps superior in some respects, but no longer recognizably human. These questions have become practically urgent as AI systems display increasingly sophisticated behaviors that suggest something like emotional responsiveness. Chen argues that Leopardi's insights about the relationship between consciousness and suffering should guide decisions about whether to develop artificial systems capable of experiences analogous to depression, anxiety, loneliness, and existential confusion. The alternative, artificial systems capable of reasoning and creativity, but incapable of suffering, may represent not the perfection of consciousness, but its abolition. Contemporary neuroscience has begun investigating whether Leopardi's insights about the relationship between suffering and beauty can be verified at the neurological level. Dr. David Park at MIT's Center for Neural Systems and Computation has used fMRI imaging to study brain activity in subjects experiencing what he calls bittersweet emotions, the complex emotional states that combine sadness with appreciation, loss with gratitude, melancholy with wonder. Park's preliminary findings suggest that these complex emotional states activate broader neural networks than either purely positive or purely negative emotions, involving simultaneous activation of regions associated with pain processing and regions associated with aesthetic appreciation. The research provides neurological support for Leopardi's insight that the capacity for suffering and the capacity for beauty may be fundamentally connected aspects of consciousness. More intriguingly, Park's research suggests that individuals who regularly experience bittersweet emotions show increased neuroplasticity and enhanced capacity for learning and adaptation. This finding supports Leopardi's intuition that accepting rather than avoiding difficult emotions may enhance rather than diminish human capabilities. The research has implications for educational practice, therapeutic intervention, and even questions of human enhancement through technological or pharmacological means. The literary influence continues to expand through contemporary writers who explicitly acknowledge Leopardi's impact on their work. Norwegian author Karl Ove Knausgård has described his multi-volume autobiographical novel My Struggle as an attempt to apply Leopardian honesty about consciousness to contemporary literary form. The novel's exhaustive attention to mundane detail combined with profound melancholy reflects Knausgård's reading of Leopardi's insight that beauty emerges from honest attention to ordinary experience rather than from romantic transformation of experience. Italian author Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan novels explicitly engage with Leopardi's legacy through their setting in Naples and their exploration of how intellectual development can become both liberation and trap. Ferrante's protagonist, like Leopardi, discovers that education provides access to broader worlds while making satisfaction with immediate circumstances more difficult. The novels examine whether this trade-off represents progress or loss, ultimately arriving at conclusions remarkably similar to Leopardi's, that consciousness necessarily involves suffering, but that suffering consciously experienced and honestly expressed can become a source of beauty and connection. Contemporary philosophers have found in Leopardi resources for addressing questions that traditional philosophical approaches seem unable to resolve. The persistent failure of moral philosophy to provide convincing universal principles, the apparent inability of political philosophy to resolve fundamental questions about justice, the ongoing debates in philosophy of mind about the nature of consciousness, all of these suggest that philosophical problems may be genuinely intractable rather than simply difficult. Leopardi's approach offers an alternative. Instead of seeking solutions to philosophical problems, philosophers might focus on helping people live well with insoluble problems. This approach, sometimes called therapeutic philosophy, emphasizes practical wisdom over theoretical knowledge, emotional insight over logical analysis, compassionate understanding over systematic explanation. Dr. Andrew Wilson, professor of philosophy at Cambridge University, has developed graduate seminars in what he calls Leopardian philosophy, philosophical practice that begins with acknowledgement of reason's limitations rather than confidence in reason's power. Wilson's students learn to approach philosophical questions not as puzzles to be solved, but as expressions of fundamental features of conscious existence that must be accepted rather than overcome. The approach has proved particularly valuable for students struggling with the anxiety and depression that appear to be epidemic among contemporary university students. Many report that traditional philosophical education, with its emphasis on critical thinking and systematic doubt, exacerbates rather than alleviates existential distress. Wilson's Leopardian approach teaches students to find in philosophical uncertainty a source of wonder rather than anxiety, in intellectual limitation a motivation for humility rather than frustration. Perhaps most importantly, Leopardi's work continues to provide what it provided for his original readers: a form of consolation that does not depend on denial of life's difficulties. In an age when traditional sources of meaning and purpose are increasingly questioned, when technological change has accelerated beyond most people's capacity to adapt, when environmental and political challenges seem to exceed human capacity to address them, Leopardi's philosophy offers a way of maintaining dignity, compassion, and commitment to beauty without requiring faith in ultimate solutions or cosmic purpose. The consolation is not based on hope that conditions will improve, but on recognition that consciousness itself, despite its limitations, its suffering, its ultimate futility, represents something valuable that deserves preservation and cultivation. This recognition provides foundation for continuing to create beauty, pursue knowledge, and practice kindness, not because these activities will achieve ultimate success, but because they express the best capacities of consciousness operating under impossible conditions. Contemporary readers report finding in Leopardi's work something increasingly rare in intellectual life: honest engagement with life's deepest difficulties combined with persistent appreciation for life's genuine beauties. His demonstration that tragic insights can become sources of beauty and wisdom rather than simply sources of despair provides guidance for how to think clearly about contemporary challenges while maintaining psychological and spiritual health. The ultimate contemporary relevance may be Leopardi's demonstration that it is possible to see clearly without becoming cynical, to acknowledge limitation without becoming resigned, to accept suffering without becoming passive. In an age characterized by information overload, emotional overwhelm, and the constant pressure to maintain optimism in the face of overwhelming evidence for pessimism, Leopardi offers an alternative: the possibility of finding in honest engagement with reality a form of beauty and meaning that requires no external validation or ultimate justification. Legacy: the philosophy of beautiful sadness for centuries after his birth. Giacomo Leopardi's influence on European culture has proved both deeper and more durable than his contemporaries could have imagined. What began as the personal philosophy of an isolated young man in provincial Italy has become a major current in modern thought, influencing fields as diverse as existential psychology, environmental ethics, literary criticism, and the philosophy of consciousness. The immediate literary influence was profound and lasting. Leopardi's technical innovations in poetry, his combination of classical formal perfection with modern emotional immediacy, his development of verse structures that seemed simultaneously inevitable and surprising established patterns that subsequent generations of poets continued to follow. Italian poetry remained under his influence well into the 20th century, with major figures like Eugenio Montale and Giuseppe Ungaretti explicitly acknowledging their debt to his formal example and philosophical insight. The influence extended beyond Italy through translation and literary transmission. French symbolist poets, particularly Baudelaire and Verlaine, found in Leopardi's work confirmation of their own insights about the relationship between beauty and suffering. German Romantic philosophers, including Schopenhauer and later Nietzsche, incorporated his psychological observations into their systematic philosophies. Russian writers, from Turgenev to Chekhov, absorbed his emotional tone and his techniques for expressing profound sadness without sentimentality. But perhaps the most significant influence has been philosophical rather than literary. Leopardi's analysis of consciousness anticipated, and in many ways surpassed, the existentialist movement that would emerge in the 20th century. His recognition that consciousness creates rather than discovers meaning, his insight that authenticity requires accepting rather than overcoming life's tragic structure, his demonstration that dignity can emerge from honest acknowledgement of limitation rather than heroic attempts to transcend it. All of these insights became central to existentialist thought, often without explicit acknowledgement of their source. Contemporary philosophy of mind has rediscovered Leopardi as a remarkably sophisticated analyst of consciousness and its discontents. His observations about the relationship between imagination and reality, his analysis of how consciousness creates expectations that reality cannot fulfill, his insights into the ways that self-awareness generates both suffering and the possibility of transcending suffering, all of these have proved remarkably prescient in light of contemporary research into depression, anxiety, and the neural basis of human unhappiness. Environmental philosophy has found in Leopardi's work resources for thinking about the human relationship to nature that avoid both romantic sentimentality and instrumental exploitation. His vision of nature as fundamentally indifferent to human welfare, combined with his argument that this indifference should inspire human solidarity rather than human resignation, provides a foundation for environmental ethics that is both realistic about natural processes and committed to human responsibility for planetary welfare. The therapeutic applications have been particularly important in recent decades. Mental health professionals have found in Leopardi's approach to suffering an alternative to both medical models that treat all negative emotions as pathological and positive psychology, approaches that emphasize optimism and resilience. His demonstration that melancholy can be transformative rather than simply destructive, that honest engagement with life's difficulties can lead to wisdom rather than despair, has influenced approaches to therapy that emphasize acceptance and meaning-making rather than symptom elimination. Educational applications have emerged in programs designed to help young people develop emotional intelligence and realistic expectations about adult life. Leopardi's work provides a model for how to discuss disappointment, loss, and limitation without either minimizing their reality or treating them as catastrophic. His combination of intellectual rigor and emotional sensitivity offers guidance for how to cultivate both critical thinking and compassion. The political implications of Leopardi's work have become increasingly apparent as democratic societies struggle with rising levels of anxiety, depression, and social fragmentation. His argument that shared human vulnerability should lead to mutual care rather than mutual exploitation provides philosophical foundation for policies that prioritize collective welfare over individual achievement. His vision of society as a social alliance among beings who share the same fundamental predicament offers an alternative to both competitive individualism and authoritarian collectivism. Perhaps most importantly, Leopardi's work continues to provide what it provided for his original readers: a form of consolation that does not depend on denial of life's difficulties. In an age when traditional sources of meaning and purpose are increasingly questioned, when technological change has accelerated beyond most people's capacity to adapt, when environmental and political challenges seem to exceed human capacity to address them, Leopardi's philosophy offers a way of maintaining dignity, compassion, and commitment to beauty without requiring faith in ultimate solutions or cosmic purpose. His vision of beautiful sadness, the idea that acknowledging life's tragic structure is the foundation for a more honest, more compassionate, and more aesthetically rich approach to existence, has become a recognized emotional and philosophical category. This is neither depression, which involves the inability to find meaning in experience, nor optimism, which involves denying the reality of life's difficulties. Instead, it is a form of clear-eyed appreciation that finds in life's very fragility the source of its preciousness. The institutional legacy is equally impressive. Academic programs in philosophy, literature, and psychology regularly include Leopardi's work as essential reading. Major museums and cultural institutions throughout Europe maintain collections and exhibitions dedicated to preserving and interpreting his contributions. The Italian government has established the annual Leopardi Prize for literary achievement, and his birthplace in Recanati has become a site of pilgrimage for readers seeking to understand the sources of his extraordinary insights. But perhaps the most important legacy is the simplest: the continuing availability of his work for readers seeking guidance about how to live with dignity in a world that often seems designed to frustrate human aspirations. His poems and philosophical writings continue to be read not as historical artifacts, but as living resources for addressing contemporary challenges. In an age of unprecedented material prosperity, combined with unprecedented levels of psychological distress, Leopardi's insights into the nature of consciousness and its discontents have proved remarkably durable and surprisingly practical. The ultimate legacy may be the demonstration that intellectual honesty and emotional health are not incompatible, that facing the most disturbing truths about existence can become the foundation for a more beautiful, more compassionate, and more genuinely human way of living. In showing that tragedy itself can be transformed into a source of beauty and wisdom, Leopardi created not just great literature, but a lasting contribution to humanity's understanding of how to transform suffering into meaning, limitation into creativity, and solitude into solidarity. The lamp still burns in the study at Recanati, though the hand that once guided its light across pages of poetry and philosophy has been still for nearly 2 centuries. The hills outside the window remain unchanged, the same horizon that young Giacomo contemplated when he imagined infinity stretching beyond the hedge that blocked his view. The library contains the same 40,000 volumes that formed his mind, though they are now preserved as monuments to the transformation of learning into wisdom, scholarship into compassion, isolation into universal connection. Giacomo Leopardi was a philosopher who taught us that life is suffering, and a poet who made that suffering beautiful. He was a scholar who used immense learning to demonstrate the limits of knowledge, and a human being who found in those very limits the source of whatever meaning consciousness can create. The contradictions were not flaws in his thinking but its essence, for he understood that consciousness itself is contradictory, capable of imagining infinities it cannot reach, conceiving perfections it cannot achieve, longing for permanence in a universe of change. We will never know whether his insights brought him peace in his final moments, whether the philosophy he developed from a lifetime of suffering provided comfort when suffering finally ended. The evidence suggests that he faced death as he had faced life, with clear sight, gentle humor, and persistent affection for the companions who shared his brief journey through existence. But perhaps the question itself misses the point that was central to his work, that meaning emerges not from outcomes, but from the quality of attention brought to experience. Not from achievements, but from the courage to continue creating beauty in the face of inevitable loss. 187 years after his death, Leopardi's voice still offers what it offered to his first readers. Not answers to the questions that torment consciousness, but a way of living beautifully with those questions. He showed that acknowledging life's tragic structure is not the end of hope, but its beginning. Not the source of despair, but the foundation for a more tender, more honest, more genuinely compassionate approach to the brief time consciousness has to experience beauty, create meaning, and extend care to other conscious beings struggling with the same impossible predicament. The broomflower still grows on the slopes of Vesuvius, finding nourishment in volcanic soil where ancient cities lie buried. It blooms and dies and blooms again, season after season, neither celebrating its mortality nor raging against it, simply expressing the beauty that emerges when life accepts the conditions within which it must operate. In this, it remains Leopardi's perfect symbol for the human possibility, not to transcend limitation, but to discover within limitation the source of whatever transcendence consciousness can achieve. Perhaps this is what endures beyond the end of every individual consciousness, not the particular insights any mind achieves, but the demonstration that consciousness itself, despite its brevity, its suffering, its ultimate futility, is valuable enough to justify its preservation, beautiful enough to warrant its cultivation, meaningful enough to deserve the tenderness with which we care for it in ourselves and others. The infinite horizon still beckons beyond every hedge that limits our view. We cannot reach it, but we can imagine it, and in that imagination, find the peculiar satisfaction that comes not from possessing what we desire, but from being the kind of beings capable of such impossible desires. The light goes out, but something of what it illuminated remains, the knowledge that even in darkness, consciousness can create its own form of illumination, brief but real, fragile but beautiful, temporary but somehow mysteriously eternal.